In a recent piece for Jacobin, co-founder of the Security Police Reform Institute, Stephen Semler, argues that the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was 20 years ago this spring, was, quote, an unmitigated disaster in 6 charts.
In a recent speech about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, President Joe Biden said, quote, the idea that over 100,000 forces would invade another country since World War II, nothing like that has happened. In response, Semler wrote in his piece, he must have a short-term memory. Policy analyst and advocate Stephen Semler is here with us to discuss further. Welcome, Stephen. I have a
Good
question.
To be here, thanks.
You know, my first question really is, if you were going to tell, our audience, like, who profited from the invasion of Iraq? You know, we heard during the invasion, we were hearing all about Halliburton and that there were government interests tied into that. Can you explain, like, who made the big bucks from this, unjust invasion?
Military contractors, for sure. People talk about the growth of the government overall, the growth of government spending. With the military sector specifically, there's a vast commercialization of Pentagon spending. What do I mean by commercialization? It means that the percentage of total Pentagon spending that goes to the private sector through contracts rose significantly. So before the war, about 40% of 40% of Pentagon spending went to private sector contracts. But by the end of the war, that number was up to 54%. And during the Iraq War, over $155 billion of private sector contracts were carried out in Iraq specifically. And that doesn't count the contracts that were carried out for the war effort that were performed in nearby countries. So as far as profitability goes, we're talking CEOs of these major weapons manufacturers. And it also kept, for the politicians, especially the neoconservatives who espoused the war and championed it, provide them some lucrative career opportunities afterwards.
We've seen, obviously, a pivot to a return of great power politics, right, between Russia and China being the primary geopolitical foes of the United States, and consequently a sort of lack of focus on the Middle East. But that region is still very volatile, as everyone knows. That there is this sort of fragile piece under the Abraham Accords and under Trump. There's been even these newest leaks, right, contain the fact that the UAE is now going to have a closer intelligence relationship with Russia, for example. Do you fear that any of this is going to drag us back to the region? Do you think the United States is, quote unquote, done with the Middle East region? Or do you think that there's the possibility that we might continue or we might end up back where we were in 2003?
It would be a tough sell to say that we'd go back to the Middle East and invade another country in that way. However, I'm not entirely sure the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the decision makers necessarily learned their lesson from Iraq. So it's possible we get dragged back in. Something similar, is going on in Syria, where U.S. and Russian forces have encountered each other violently at times due to competing interests that are being carried out in a theater in the global south or in the Middle East.
So with the lessons learned from Iraq, and this is kind of piggybacking off of Inez's question, do you think that has informed the foreign policy that we have with Iran? And do you think that the U.S. is going to, obviously, as you stated, they probably are not going to invade in that way, but do you think that the goal is still regime change in Iran?
It depends which part of the foreign policy establishment you're talking about. There's definitely hostility towards Iran. I don't really know what the end game is, and I'm not sure the U.S. knows what its end game is either. I mean, it's such a currency of using sanctions and war as foreign policy tools that they've essentially developed like value in their own. So it's like the sanctions that we're putting on Iran, or the amount of U.S. forces that the U.S. is sending to the Middle East to confront, in some ways, directly or indirectly, Iranian forces or Iranian proxy forces. It's kind of become a measure on its own. So I'm not sure the U.S. actually has like a considerable, like a coherent strategy going on here, other than just kind of fueling off the legacies of the Iraq War, which is just leaving troops in the region and essentially baiting violence towards them. And essentially creating crisis mode. And you saw a different approach with China, who came in with a sound diplomatic strategy and was able to get some things done.
I took this opportunity to go back and read George W. Bush's second inaugural address, trying to put myself back 20 years ago and 15 years ago, rather, when this war was still going on in a hot way. And I was struck by some of the language reading it again. So, for example, he said at his second inaugural, the ultimate goal of the United States is ending tyranny in our world, right? These are very grandiose ambitions, especially sounds very different in 2023 when we're so unsure that, I think domestically, that we can even stave off tyranny at home. Do you think that the United States and our domestic problems and the fact that Americans are losing so much faith in our institutions, both military and otherwise, how do you think that impacts the ability of the U.S. And how does it impact the U.S., one, to project power abroad, and two, to use this kind of soft cultural influence, because we still see the United States, for example, becoming known even in our allies like France as sort of a projecting cultural, cultural leftism, basically. We are the progenitor of all kinds of sort of cultural domestic issues that our allies and then also our enemies like Russia claim that the United States is basically pushing on the world. Do you think that legacy of this sort of ultimate goal of ending tyranny? He also talked about, that the survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. What is the relationship between American domestic sort of vision of ourselves and our ability to project power among, throughout the world? And I realize that's a very big question, but I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
Sure, there's multiple ways to answer that question too, but one is just that, when you hear speeches, whether it's by Bush or Biden or Trump or Obama, that there's this assumption that the U.S. has a credibility to project power abroad and essentially station troops or carry out other missions abroad that don't exactly resonate with many people, particularly in developing countries. So if you look at the coalition that Biden has tried to build using democracy, this democracy versus autocracy struggle to rally international support against Russia and against China, it's had limited success in Europe, essentially NATO countries, but hardly any success, I would say, in the global South, in developing countries. Because if you think about it, when Biden talks about democracy promotion, given his history as a champion of the Iraq War, and considering that hundreds of thousands of people died under this guise of democracy promotion in the Middle East, it's hard for people in developing countries to take that seriously. Now, if Biden came into office and offered a different roadmap where the U.S. would value state sovereignty above that and actually demonstrate that the U.S. is willing to essentially change its tenor abroad, then I think Biden would have a little bit more success in terms of rallying the world stage behind the U.S., but that just hasn't happened because I think this Iraq war almost permanently damaged U.S. credibility, and particularly that of Biden, who is such a strong champion for it.
Now, you explained in your piece that the troop-to-contractor ratio in Iraq was about 1-to-1 for the first few years after the invasion, and even became more contractor-dominant as the war progressed. All told, the United States spent more than $155 billion on contractors in Iraq from fiscal years 2003 to 2022. Tell us a little more about that.
So the use of contractors, it's grown over time. World War II, it wasn't, it was like 7-to-1 or something for the U.S. troop to contractor ratio. Climbed up to, I think, like 5-to-1 in Vietnam, but the Iraq War was, as you said, a 1-to-1. And there are multiple reasons for that. It depends. If you ask an egghead in the Pentagon, for example, they tell you it's about efficiency and saving money. But if you talk to politicians, using contractors is a good way to bring the U.S. body count down, to prevent too much trouble as far as domestic concerns go, where the U.S. public is concerned about U.S. troop deaths. Contractors are a good way around the formidable disclosures. If you look at Syria, for example, the first acknowledgement of U.S. military presence on the ground came through the Department of Labor casualty report that a contractor was injured in there, was injured in the country. So using contractors, essentially commercializing it, is a good way for the government to distance itself from the violence and policies that are enacted on the ground, because it's proprietary interest. It's not publicly available information.
Well, thank you a whole lot, Stephen. That was really informative. We really appreciate you. More Rising after this.
Thanks so much.